forms that we have. The FERPTA is the Foreign Investment in Real Estate, Real Property Tax Act. That's what FERPTA stands for. And it in here it references a section of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code. And it is the purpose of that is to be able to determine if they are a foreign entity or alien that does not have a Social Security card. And probably all the offers that I reviewed, there are probably maybe less than 5% that come through. And when I see one, I'm a little bit shocked, because most people, when they come to the United States right now, they just set you up with a Social Security number and give you a card and you're good to go. But when people are buying property, it's really important, if they are not a US citizen and they're a foreign alien, that the IRS get their piece of the pie before, because if they leave and they're not in the United States, then it's really difficult to get a hold of that particular money. And one of the things that I found really interesting with the FERPTA certification is this is a responsibility. It relies heavily on the buyer. And when you think about it, the buyer is responsible in this transaction to find out and make sure if the seller is a foreign person or for the purposes of US taxation or not. And like I said, the majority of time, everybody has a Social Security number anymore. But it was interesting to me that they made the buyer responsible. And the penalty, if it isn't declared and withdrawn and sent to the IRS, then the IRS could literally come back onto the buyer. And let's just say it's a $450,000 home. And I think it's, let me just see what that is. That could be a tax for like a $450,000 home. That could be a tax from $7,500 to $10,000. And so we want to really make sure that we ask the sellers in a very nice way to be able to fill that out and take care of that. In checking with Russ, he has requested that all of our brokers use the FERPTA form in every transaction, and it's just to be on the safe side. The seller should provide this to the listing broker, which you have on your listing. And if the seller is a foreign purpose, then the closing agent is instructed to withhold that either 10 or 15% for taxes. And wait a second, let me do that again. Okay, so that could be up to 45,000 to over 50,000. I was doing our excise tax, and it should be 10 to 15%. So it's really important that we get that information from our sellers, and so that the closing agent can do that. The purchase and sale agreement warrants that a seller is or is not a foreign person. And so the seller must complete the FERPTA form or the equivalent, and then turn that into the IRS. Into the closing agent. Now, if you take a look at the form, it shows that, if you look at this on line 10, that always needs to be checked. So in your template, if you have a template for homes, condos, and vacant land, and you put the FERPTA in all of those, then you can always, in advance, you can check that so that when it's downloaded, it always shows up as a checkbox. Then you put in the address that they're selling, and they're certifying that they're the seller of real property. Check that box, what the complete address, city, state, and zip is. Now, if for some reason it is vacant land and no street address has been assigned, then we go down to the checkbox on line 12. We check that, and then we attach the legal description. And the next one is then they choose on line 13, either I am or am not a resident. And then we never fill in the bottom, that portion that has the tax ID number. When I had a lot of listings, I would fill that out when I gave that to them. I would check the box on 10, and then I would put 3 X's dash, 2 X's dash, and then 4 X's, just so that they wouldn't fill it in, and explain to them that the closing agent will have you sign a complete form on that. And then if you are not at this address that you're selling, they must include a address that they can be reached at. And then, of course, then they sign it and date it. Typically, if this is a married couple, you can do one FERPTA. But if for some reason one of them is a non-resident alien and the other is a citizen, then then we would need to fill one out for each person. Okay, any questions on that so far?
Yeah. Marcia, for the tax ID number, you said that part on line 16, don't fill that out?
That's correct.
Okay.
And
And then,
I just put X's like you would a social security number. They all start
okay,
out 3 X's dash, 2 X's dash, 4 X's.
okay. And then
That's,
you provide that number to the buyer's agent?
no, the seller gives it to the closing agent at escrow.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
we never record their social security number, and we never put it on a public document that could be used.
Okay.
Okay.
Mhm.
And Blanca is online. And Blanca, if you want to just open up your audio, then we can, you can ask a question at any time. So we talked about filling out the top portion of that, and then filling out the bottom portion. Okay, so rarely will you fill this out, and the only time that a buyer fills it out is when they know the seller is a non-resident alien. And it's really interesting. The last 2 weeks, I've had 2 that have come in. And so in that case, if you find out, and this is if you're representing a buyer and you find out that the seller is a non-resident, then you're going to have to fill out the bottom portion, but only if they're a non-resident. Um, February the 17th, 2016, the FERPTA withholding, the base amount is 15% and of the purchase price, of the final purchase price. And as I said before, buyer certification is only used if the seller is a non-resident alien. If neither box is applicable, then the seller does not sign and date anything. So if it is their uh, a resident alien, then you don't have to fill any of this out. And remember that at closing, they take 15% typically, um, and withhold that. And then after closing, they take those funds and they mail it directly to the IRS. The seller never takes possession of that money. So there are two exceptions. Um, Number one is if the amount does not exceed 300,000 and the buyer will use the property as their primary residence or personal residence, there is no tax that is withheld. And this is all upfront. If they're using it as like a rental property would be a good example, then then they will withhold 15%. If the amount is from 300,000 but not exceeding $1 million, and it's going to be a family residence, the buyer will use the property as their primary residence, then the tax withheld by the closing agent is 10%. So if that's a $800,000 home, that's $80,000. That's a significant payment. And yeah, so we want to really make sure that we that we make sure that we fill this form out correctly. And it says under penalties of perjury, and this is a US law. And so I'm sure that they're not real understanding with, oh, I didn't understand that form. And remember that we are at the same level as an attorney. When we're allowed certain privileges that an attorney has when we fill out these forms. So the responsibility is really important. Let me see. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, I did.
I do have a question for you, Marcia.
Sure.
So the FERPTA form, when you ask that question, like, do you have a social security number? They say yes, and then we just fill it out. But for example, like I have a social security number, but I'm not a resident alien. How would that work for a person like me? Like if I'm selling my home?
You have a social security number.
Uh-huh.
And so you would be well, it is my understanding that as long as you have that, then escrow, when they do closing, that is such a great question. Okay, so, but you have let me see how we say this right here. You would, you're saying that you would check the M not or N, a non-resident alien.
Yeah, I am a non-resident alien. For purposes.
Okay. Yeah, and then what would happen because you have your social security number, then they would not have to withhold that at closing.
Okay, and so would I fill out the the section below the buyer certification?
Your buyer would have, the buyer of, if it's you personally, yes, but if you were a buyer, it's only the sellers that we're looking at,
Gotcha. Okay.
okay?
Yes. Yep. Only if the seller is a non-resident agent. Okay. So the buyer
Right.
would have to look at this.
Yes, and fill that out.
Gotcha. Okay.
And it's all around the seller,
Okay.
okay? Uh, so another thing is if you have more than one seller, for an example, we frequently see where uh, an offer will come through with two people and they go through their lending process and they need to have somebody else sign. And so they bring them in. And so for um, each seller, no, that's a buyer. I'm sorry. If you have a seller that has 3 or 4 people named on your title, then they need to fill one out for each person to verify that that they all have a social security number or a tax ID number. For an example, if you had an LLC or a partnership, when you set that up with the government, they give you a tax identification number. And then that usually starts with like 9-1. So for corporations, LLCs, partnerships, and when I was doing my research, they also said an estate, and an estate may not have to fill out a Form 17, but they do have to fill out a FERPTA form.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if a person is has a green card, they have a social
Mhm.
security number.
Yep.
And yeah, and so there that's different because they have a social security number that the tax form will go in from closing for your for the amount of money that you after that you sold the property for, I believe. I have to stop and think about that. And that's why if you are selling your property, then you need to make sure that you keep all the records for all the expenses, commissions, closing cost, escrow, filing fees, things like that. Okay, so how do we protect our buyer? The FERPTA form is the best protection for both the buyer and the closing agent, because those are the two people that are going to be held responsible if the information is not correct. And it is very important that we require a FERPTA to be delivered to the buyer. And um, and this can be the FERPTA is unlike the Form 17. Delivery can be up in associated documents. So it's our responsibility if we're representing the buyer to make sure that they have it. And you know what I like to do when I was doing offers and everything, I would just have my initial, my buyer's initial the top and date it. And all that did was just to verify they received this document. And that helps to protect your buyer. Um, in the purchase and sale agreement on like a 21, I think it's line 13 or 14, it will say FERPTA, yes or no. So if the listing broker does a really good job and shows that that it is not necessary to have additional documentation, that they are either have a green card or a social security number, or they're in the M not section, then if you use a transaction desk, then that information will come forward on your document for your buyer. If you
Okay.
don't know what it is, you, as a buyer broker, you leave that blank. And then just in your email to the listing broker, say, I didn't see the FERPTA, and I need to, and I wasn't sure if they were a non-resident or a resident. And so that is really important that we do that. As I explained, this tax, if it's 10 or 15%, and you have a $500,000 house, we're talking at a minimum $50,000. So it's very important that we make sure that's taken care of. And my last comment then is the buyer broker should never mark a box regarding the seller's FERPTA status when it is not known. That is very, very important.
And how
Okay.
would you ask Marsha, like, what would be the, like, how would you ask the listing agent, like, does your client have a FERPTA?
Yeah, just you will just like when you reach mutual,
Uh-huh.
then you just congratulate them and say you're looking forward to receiving them, and would they please send you the Form 19, the fully filled out Form 22K, and the FERPTA. If
Gotcha.
it's older than 1978, then the 22J as well. Those are typically really um, not a part of the contract, but they're a very important part of the transaction.
Okay.
And that's a good way. If you, one of the best tools that I had, of course, was my husband, but he made a great
Mhm.
checklist. And if you check with Ashley, I believe that she might have a checklist, and it's also the foundation for like a transaction coordinator. And you need to know all the things and all the steps that uh, throughout a transaction. And that way you don't forget.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so what do your sellers need to know? Escrow, as I said, will fill in the tax identification number. We should never put them on that form. And each seller should be accounted for. So if it is like et al, ETAL, that means that one person can sign for everybody. Then you just need to go back and say, everybody that's a part of this, um, are they, do they all have social security numbers, or any of them non-resident alien? And that's the best that we can do. And we have a backup plan for that if your sellers do not participate, don't, are not forthcoming in that. We need to just make sure that they are. Um, and then also on a seller, for an example, if you were to uh, have a home in your name and you're selling it and you're a non-resident alien, and but you have a social security number, then you still want to advise your sellers to talk to a tax professional, somebody that knows about the FERPTA and the withholding and how to deal with that. And so when you're selling your home, you probably should do that anyways, so that you can pay the least amount of taxes um, allowable. If the seller is selling personal property like a mobile home, that the title has not been eliminated, and say maybe this is in a park, they're subject to a Form 17, but that does not trigger the FERPTA certification. So let me say that a different way. You have a seller come to you, they live in a like a senior uh, park, and they lease their lot, their slot or lot, wherever they are. There's not a slip. and they are selling their manufactured home. Okay, so we have that as a 23 when we're doing a purchase and sale agreement. And like I said, that will, they absolutely need to do a Form 17 on all the applicable parts, but that does not trigger a FERPTA. And the FERPTA must be signed, or an individual FERPTA, for all the sellers. And if it is a non-alien situation, then encourage your buyers to seek the advice as well of a tax accountant to make sure that when they purchase that home, that they're really well protected. If it's an estate, and usually the way that you see that, they've transferred the title to the estate of Marcia Brasher. And if you see something like that, or there's a trustee, remember, they're not going to know the Form 17, but they also should seek a tax accountant to make sure if they need to fill out a FERPTA for that particular property. If it's an estate, the seller is obligated to pay any federal taxes, just as any seller is, but the buyer is at risk if the foreign estate seller fails to do so. So estate seller should complete and provide a full Form 22E, the FERPTA, to certify their status. Listing broker should have the seller fill it out and sign it, and then send it to the closing agent as soon as you get a purchase and sale agreement, copying the buyer broker as you do that. And then make sure that once you have that FERPTA filled out, that you upload it into the associated documents. Okay, any questions on how to protect your buyer or the seller?
No, I think the seller, like the highlights that I took away, is how to protect your seller. Each seller needs to sign it. And if it's at all, we have to ask if they all have social security numbers.
And
If they
need to sign those, yes.
Yeah, and if it's a non-resident alien situation, then we recommend them to seek professional tax advice. And how to talk to a seller, or how to protect our buyer, make sure the FERPA is delivered to the buyer, have them initial and date stamp it. That way it's kind of like an insurance policy for us. And then the purchase and sale agreement, if it's blank, leave it blank. Don't check it.
If it doesn't show up in or autofill and we don't know, then we don't touch it. That's correct.
Okay. And yeah, I think that's my takeaways.
Okay, good job. When we send this out, I have 2 pages of notes of everything that I've talked about. So 2 last subjects. We're going a little bit over here, but I'll be fast. I called up escrow and I talked to Annie at CW Title, and she's on Amy Tibbetts' team, and she has been great. And so I wanted to find out, because they're probably the most liable besides the buyer. And so I asked her what their process was. And as soon as they get a purchase and sale agreement, then they do the opening documents for the seller, and they start asking them these questions, and they fill out all the information. So if they know at the beginning of a transaction, then they have time and do their research, and then then if they are aliens, then they will, they have a certain process that they go through. At closing, they sign a W-9 and they withhold either the 10 or the 15%, and that they send directly to the IRS, depending on the circumstances, what the percentage is. And I asked her, what is the thing that you see most that isn't correct when the FERPTA is sent in? And she said, probably almost always it's line 13, where the am or am not is not checked. And so if we go back down here, that goes right into my last comments in compliance, what's needed. The most missed information is the box, that's number 1 right there on line 10, that isn't checked. And if I see that, I'll send that back, I'll return it, and you just have to check it. And then if it's the address, then that part of it is complete. And then if it's not, then make sure that you have, and I forgot to say this earlier, it's either the purchase and sale agreement or a legal description is attached to the FERPTA. So the legal description is easier than an entire um, uh, purchase and sale agreement. And then the next thing that I find that isn't checked is on line 13. I am or am not a non-resident alien, which drives me crazy because that's like a double negative. Let me see, and then signatures, make sure the sellers sign and date it. And then on the bottom, I just check to see if they are am not, then I check to make sure that the bottom part of it is filled out. And that either one of those, and then remember that if it's over $1 million, then you just want to make sure your buyers are all over that, and also escrow. So we do have a backup plan where when escrow goes through that first documentation, when they open up a transaction and send it all to the sellers, early on in the process, they'll determine if they need to take that further. Okay. Any questions?
Nope. That's good that they're so like forthcoming with all this information.
Yeah, it's really important, and to protect our buyers and ourselves, because can you imagine what happens if we go through and 6 months to 9 months later, the buyers come back and say, I've just been given a bill for $50,000 from the IRS. What is this about?
Yeah.
And we do not want that.
Okay. Has that
Um,
happened that you've personally seen?
No,
Marcia?
it has, I
No.
haven't. And not that I know of. Escrow would know more if they've had any of those, but they really, for their, I don't know if they call their insurance E&O insurance or something like that. They really have their own process, but we need to really make sure that we just tighten this up and we just be as professional about this as possible.
Awesome.
Okay, well, Blanca, and do you pronounce it Yesenia?
Yep.
Perfect. I just would hate to call you by the wrong name. Anyways,
Yeah.
thank you for attending. And when Ashley sends out the notes, then you'll get a good recount of everything that I went over.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcia.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Blanca says thank you too on her notes.
Oh, good. Oh, there. I guess I should. Alrighty. Well, you guys
Bye.
have a great rest of your day.